Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there on a long and productive day already. My name is Johannes. I'm the director of the Public Economics program here at the CEPR and professor at the London School of Economics. And I have the honor to host or to chair this panel. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you. And we're going to launch the CEPR. It's called an e-book, but there are a couple of hard copies available as well, called Rethinking Pension Reform. And we'll have then a panel on pensions and longevity that will follow the presentation. So we'll start with a presentation of the e-book by Giulia Giupponi from Bocconi, and then Arthur Seibold from Mannheim. And the idea of the book was to really present the challenges facing pension systems and the responses by governments through pension reforms. And it complements that with a collection of findings from cutting-edge research, and then it tries to distill some key policy recommendations. And so after the presentation, we'll hear some reflections from an esteemed panel of experts on pensions and longevity. In fact, we're also marking an important milestone for the CEPR, which is the launch of its new Aging and Longevity Network, and it's directed by Professor Andrew Scott, who is currently on leave from the London Business School and now directing the very ambitious Allison Institute of Technology at Oxford. And his network here at the CEPR will bring together researchers and policymakers trying to tackle the multidimensional challenges of aging societies, going much beyond pensions as well. And so Andrew is part of our panel today, and we're looking forward to hearing his broader perspective as well. So for the organization of this panel, we're very, very much following the CEPR's adage, which is to bridge the gap between research and policy. In fact, at some point we had two ministers lined up for this. So there was Frank van den Broeke, Minister of Health in Belgium, but currently in active negotiations regarding the new government. And then there was Astrid Panosyan, Minister of Employment here in France of the government that was resolved last week. So she had to cancel very, very last minute, unfortunately. So we're less represented by politicians today, but we have a very, very strong panel of people who not only have impressive academic credentials, but who've all of them been very active in policy or in shaping the public debates. So let me briefly introduce them. So there's Dorothée Rouzet, who obtained her PhD at Harvard, has taken several roles in policy, and now, since the summer of 2023, is a chief economist at French Treasury. So her strategic oversight of France's economic policy will help her to shed light on the fiscal challenges, for instance, highlighted in the e-book as well. Then there is Antoine Bozio, who is professor at the Paris School of Economics and the director of the Institut de Politique Publique, and it's the go-to institute when we want quantitative evaluations and recommendations on public policy in France. And Antoine personally has been researching pensions and has been a very important voice in the debates around the French pension reforms or the attempts thereto. So he's also co-author of one of the chapters of the e-book. And then last and not least, there is Camille Landais, who's professor at the London School of Economics. He's the director of the Conseil d'Analyse Économique, the French Council of Economic Advisors, where he advises the French government on economic policy. And he does so credibly on many policies, but also on pensions, as he has been one of the drivers of some of the recent research on pension reforms, also focusing on distributional impacts. And so together we wrote one of the chapters of the e-book, as well as the concluding chapter drawing the policy implications. And then finally, I already introduced Andrew Scott. He's a renowned expert on aging and longevity. And his latest book, for instance, The Longevity Imperative, was nominated for Financial Times Best Book Awards, and it followed the extraordinary success of his earlier work, The 100-Year Life, which sold over 1 million copies. So now I invite the editors of the e-book that we owe many, many thanks for putting all this work together. So Giulia and Arthur, they will present the key findings of the e-book.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Thank you all for being with us today. So Arthur and I are going to give you an overview of the ebook Rethinking Pension Reforms that we have co-edited under the sponsorship of CEPR. Now, I think we all know that populations are aging rapidly across the developed world. The old age dependency ratio, that is the ratio of the population age 65 plus to the population age 20 to 64, is currently 33% in Europe and North America and is projected to reach 50% by 2050. These demographic trends are putting enormous pressure on the fiscal sustainability of public pension systems. If you consider that pensions are already the single largest item of public expenditure in most OECD countries, and they're projected to further increase over the coming decades. So in response to these trends and pressures, governments around the world have implemented or are planning reforms that, despite their specificities and complexities, tend to all share the same common goal, which is to encourage people to retire later. At the same time, of this intense policy response, there's kind of a new body of academic research that has emerged, in particular empirical research, that has significantly advanced our understanding of what works in retirement policy. So the primary objective of our ebook is precisely to review these new academic advances in a non-technical way in order to, first of all, provide an overview of both the functioning and the effectiveness of different policy design choices for encouraging later retirement, but also to try and distill practical lessons that we hope can really inform policymaking and more generally the debate around pension policy that is currently ongoing. So Arthur and I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the authors of the different chapters for their contributions. They're all excellent contributions. Camille and Johannes for kind of enabling the realization of this project, and CEPR for generously sponsoring it. So what's the starting point of our ebook? I think we can all agree that pension reforms tend to be especially complex. But what we argue is that behind the veil of complexity that they have, the majority of pension reforms that have been implemented over the past 30 years in Europe and also in North America tend to all kind of operate four key policy levers that are meant basically to restore fiscal sustainability by encouraging people to retire later. What are these four policy levers? Well, first, a reduction in the level of pension benefits that should induce people to retire later, work more. Second, strengthening marginal financial incentives, meaning kind of rewarding postponements in retirement. Third, increasing the earliest age at which people can start claiming benefits. This is the so-called early retirement age. And finally, increasing the age at which they can start receiving full benefits, the normal retirement age. Now, if we look at this chart that plots OECD averages over the past 20 years, we can see that there's been kind of changes across all these four policy levers. Starting from the left, you can see that the gross replacement rate of pensions, a measure of pension levels, is nowadays, on average, lower than it was 20 years ago. A similar trend we observe in the second kind of column, the implicit tax on working longer, which is basically an inverse measure of the reward to postponing retirement, has also decreased over time. And finally, there have been substantial increases in both the early and the normal retirement ages. In fact, these are projected to increase further over the coming years. And I should say that from our review of recent pension reforms, these are kind of the two routes that most governments have undertaken in their reforms. So what the ebook does is to basically review the evidence that we have on the effectiveness of these different tools in encouraging a later retirement or in affecting retirement behavior more generally. But I think what's key is that we try not to stop there, so not to think just about retirement behavior effects, but also about kind of the fiscal effects and, importantly, the distributional effects of different policy levers. And so I leave the floor to Arthur, who is going to give you the kind of insights of the ebook on all these dimensions.
Great. So in the next few minutes, we'll talk about the main findings of the book, and this will be organized around a set of policy lessons that draw on the more detailed analysis of the different chapters of the book. And these policy lessons are also described in the concluding chapter of the book. As Giulia said, the primary objective of many pension reforms has been to encourage later retirement and improve the fiscal balance of the pension system. And so the first set of insights will speak to this objective. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So the first lesson is about the relative effectiveness of different policy tools at influencing retirement behavior. So lesson number one is that statutory retirement ages are highly effective at inducing later retirement, financial incentives much less so. So there's a large body of empirical evidence that shows that increasing both early or normal retirement ages induces large retirement delays and positive fiscal effects for the pension system. One key theme in this literature is that at least part of this large effect is due to a behavioral mechanism where workers view these ages as reference points for retirement. They view them as kind of normal times or ages to retire that are set by the government. An alternative policy that many governments have pursued is to strengthen marginal financial incentives for later retirement. So this would typically be explicit financial penalties for early retirement and rewards for late retirement. However, empirical evidence shows that these marginal financial incentives have quite limited effects on retirement behavior and, in fact, mixed effects on the fiscal balance. The second lesson in this area is that cutting pension levels induces later retirement. So another common policy response, often directly in response to fiscal problems, has been to cut the level of pension benefits. Empirical evidence that's discussed in one of the book chapters shows that such a policy increases labor supply both close to and far from retirement. In fact, these increases in labor supply can be substantial, which then implies that there's a sort of double dividend of this policy from a fiscal point of view. So there's a direct fiscal effect from reducing pension payments, plus the behavioral effect from increases in labor supply. But it's important to keep in mind that, of course, this policy causes substantial welfare losses to affected individuals, and that ultimately needs to be traded off against the fiscal gains. And yeah, so I will talk more later about these distributional issues. The third lesson is that pension reforms have spillover effects onto other social insurance programs. Of course, pension systems operate in a broader landscape of institutions, which includes other social insurance programs. And this is what one of the book chapters discusses. So there's empirical evidence that when retirement ages increase as a result of pension reforms, there is indeed some substitution from old age pensions towards two programs in particular, unemployment and disability insurance. However, usually the magnitude of these spillovers is insufficient to offset the direct fiscal effect of the reforms. So while it's important to consider these spillovers in designing reforms, they typically don't radically alter their fiscal effects. So far, I've talked about effects on retirement behavior and fiscal effects, which is often the main subject of public debates around pension reform. But another important role of pension systems is to provide insurance and to redistribute resources across individuals. And so the second set of insights that I'll talk about will speak to this role. The first lesson in this area is that reforms that penalize early retirement and reward late retirement are regressive. So penalizing early retirement and rewarding later retirement not only changes retirement incentives from the point of view of an individual, but also redistributes from the group of early retirees towards the group of late retirees. And empirical evidence that's discussed in one of the book chapters shows that early retirees tend to be worse off in a number of dimensions. So they tend to be poorer, they tend to have lower consumption at old age, they tend to be in worse health, and have lower life expectancy. So this implies redistributing away from early retirees is regressive, and then this implies that there's a trade-off between fiscal consolidation and equity concerns. So this kind of reform improves incentives for later retirement, but can have detrimental effects from a distributional point of view. Moreover, and that's lesson number 5, disparities in life expectancy challenge the fairness of pension systems. So this is the subject of a chapter of the book that talks about pronounced and widening differences in life expectancy that have been found empirically. These are by income, by wealth, by gender, by ethnicity, and so on. And overall, it turns out that better off individuals tend to receive higher lifetime benefit payments. So there is a kind of regressive tendency in pension systems as a result of that. And that's also important to take into account in thinking about reforms. And finally, to wrap up, the last policy lesson is that in thinking about the trade-off between fiscal consolidation and equity concerns, it's key to think about the targeting of pension reforms. So the concluding chapter of the book argues that it's possible to identify pension reforms that can induce later retirement, improve retirement incentives, while minimizing distributional costs, or perhaps even implying distributional gains. So just as an example, empirically, individuals that retire at intermediate ages, so somewhat early but not very early, tend to be well off. And so putting in place steeper incentives for this particular group can potentially improve the fiscal balance and also lead to equity gains. Great, so to conclude, in this ebook, we analyze what works in encouraging later retirement and improving the fiscal balance of the pension system. We do highlight the trade-off between fiscal consolidation and equity concerns. And ultimately, we hope that this book can contribute to public debates and be an input for these debates around creating pension systems that are both financially sound and socially equitable. And yeah, the book is freely available on the CEPR website for those who are interested in finding out more. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Arthur. Thanks a lot, Giulia. So we move on to our panel, and I first invite Dorothée to give her perspective. So we're very interested to hear about the French context as well, and whether there are any lessons for the French Treasury to draw from the ebook, or any important gaps that we have in the book.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the ebook. I think it's very interesting, and indeed it echoes a number of issues that we have in terms of designing pension reforms, and that we are grappling with every few years, especially in the context of the last pension reform that happened in 2023. I would say the way I would frame it is, I mean, you framed it as trade-offs between fiscal consolidation and equity. So to make things a little simpler, I would say in my mind there are sort of 4 dimensions that we need to balance, not just 2. One is fiscal sustainability. One is distributional impacts, and that's, I mean, you talked about sort of horizontal distribution, I mean, in a way, within a generation, or within, at some point in time, who pays. I would say there's also issues between generations. Then I would also say some important dimensions are what are the impact of the reforms on potential growth, that's the labor supply impact in particular, and also political and social acceptability, which can go beyond distributional impacts. And with that, we have different levers, as you said. I mean, there's a sort of minimum and normal retirement age, there's career length, and how many years do you need to work in order to qualify for a full pension, and then the sort of equity concerns. You have minimum pension, some exemptions from age. Here, I would not go into increasing contribution rates for a simple reason, which is that France is a little specific in that in the long term, if we look at long-term projection, it does not necessarily have projected increase in pension spending to GDP ratio over the next decades, for reasons that we can come back to later. But this ratio is already among the highest in the EU, so I think the levers are more on the spending side. Very quickly for non-French people, so what did we do in the 2023 pension reform, which was highly contentious? First, I mean, the French system has sort of a dual rule. of retirement age, of a statutory retirement age at which you can start claiming benefits, and required contribution period, which is the time you need to have worked and contributed in order to qualify for a full pension. So in the last pension reform, the main lever that was mobilized was the statutory retirement age, which is gradually being raised from 62 to 64 at a pace of 3 months per generation. But at the same time, it also accelerated the ramp-up of a previous pension reform, which was playing on the contribution period, so raising it from 42 to 43 years in order to get a full pension. And at the same time, there were some measures that were designed to make the pension fairer in terms of taking into account the situation of people who start work very early, so extending a scheme which allows people to retire earlier if they started working earlier, and also increasing the minimum pension for people who have had a full career, but on, for instance, a full career on minimum wage. And making sure that over time this would stay at 85% of the minimum pension would stay at 85% of the minimum wage when it had been falling behind the minimum wage. Now, how do we think about this in the context of the sort of 4 criteria that I listed at the beginning? So I would say the first criteria is, what is the impact on potential growth? And here, I mean, if you think of the different levers, clearly working longer is a better option because you get this double dividend on fiscal and macro side of more labor supply, more labor income, and therefore more consumption, even in somewhat short term. Whereas raising contributions, you get the opposite effect. You get discouraging impact on labor supply, less disposable income, and therefore less consumption. And lowering pension benefits, so I hear the argument that we find effect on boosting the labor supply, but that's more, I guess, a medium-term effect. Once people adjust, it's less immediate than when you extend the retirement age and then just people keep working who are in work. And in the short term, you also have a negative impact on aggregate demand simply by the fact that if you lower pension benefits, retirees have less income. On my second criteria, which is also, I mean, this pleads for sort of going through the working longer route, and as you show well in the ebook, this is what most countries have gone for. On fiscal sustainability, I think the lesson from even when we evaluated the reform before and after is that if you look only at the balance of the pension system, you miss most of the picture, and really most of the impact goes through these macro channels. So when we looked at what would the reform do in terms of improving the fiscal balance, so on the expenditure side, you have a direct effect because, well, people retire later, so you pay less in pensions. And we estimated that this effect by 2027, so after a few years, would result in a gain of 0.1 percentage points of GDP in terms of improvement in the fiscal balance after taking into account the mitigating measures, increasing the minimum pension, etc. So that's 0.1 percentage point of GDP. On the revenue side, the gains come not only from increased contribution paid into the pension system, but they're much wider. Because if you have an increase in the labor supply and an increase in employment, then you get higher tax revenue on all dimensions, including income tax, etc. And that's what we saw over the last 20 years as well. This is not the first time we increased the retirement age, and in general, that's the bigger effect. So when we estimated what would be the impact of the 2023 reform, we estimated that it would lead to an extra 200,000 additional jobs by 2027. And through the increase in economic activity and the tax revenues that come with it, improve the fiscal balance by 0.4 percentage points on GDP. So 80% of the effect comes from this macro channel. Then my third criteria was distributional impacts. And I mean, you've talked about it. You talk about it in the book, and I think it's very interesting to think about it along different dimensions. Of course, it's very different, again, depending on which lever you use. And working longer or increasing contributions, well, that puts a burden on people who are currently working. Lowering pension benefits puts a burden primarily on people, at least in the short to medium term, on people who are already retired. But even within the sort of working longer set of levers, you can have very different choices and not easy choices. And to take the example of this sort of dual system that we have in France, there was a debate on which one should you act on. Increasing the minimum retirement age, which is what was done, I mean, it has. I mean, the main argument for it is really on the sort of immediate macro and labor supply side. It has the most impact on the labor supply, as the ebook shows, probably even beyond sort of what we might expect, because it acts as an anchor of when it is normal to retire. But it also affects disproportionately people who started working early, who are also people who did not have higher education, who may work in more manual or repetitive jobs, who tend to have lower earnings, simply because, well, if you need to work for 43 years and you cannot retire before to have a full pension, and the anchor beyond the retirement age, the other anchor for people is, well, when do I qualify for a full pension? So basically, if you started working before 19, you're going to work your 43 years and you're not yet 64. So then it is really binding for you. If you went to university, started working at 23, well, by the time you're 64, you still haven't done your 43 years, so it's not binding. So in terms of distributional impact, this is not really what you want. On the other hand, if you raise the number of years of contribution in order to get a full pension, then it is more binding for including people who did long studies, who have more intellectual jobs, who are higher earners, and this sounds more desirable. But at the same time, it also will penalize people who had career breaks, and especially mothers often. And there is really no way to disentangle, to say, well, I would like to catch the high income earners, but I do not want to penalize mothers with lower pensions, because, well, if you stop working for 10 years in order to raise your kids, you will not have worked for 43 years, and then you will get lower pension benefits. So again, not easy distributional choices. My very last point, very quickly, on political acceptability. I mean, of course, distributional concerns are a big part of political acceptability, but I would say there are other dimensions too, and we may have learned that the hard way in sort of succession of failed and successful pension reforms, in both cases probably hotly contested. One is reforms need to be sufficiently simple, and that's where and the last point of the ebook sounds maybe very smart, and you can play on the sort of fine sets of parameters in order to make it fairer. But it is also true that when you have a very complex system, if you do a very complex reform that is really hard to understand because people can't really easily grasp how it will affect me, everyone thinks they will lose out, at least in France. Whereas retirement age, it may be unfair on some dimension, but it's very easy to understand. It's very easy to understand how you will be affected. And in some ways, that makes it a bit easier to explain. Same thing, it's easier to give exemptions from the age for people in hard jobs and to try to assess finally, well, what is exactly a physically hard job, which, you get into different sets of criteria, and it's never perfect. And maybe last point about acceptability, I think we have to think about perceptions and salience in the political economy equation. Two examples for that. One is there is a difference between default rules and discretionary decisions, which can be on indexation of pension benefits. For instance, indexing to if it's automatic, pensions automatically increase with inflation. Well, if you decide to not cut pension benefits but increase them less, it is a discretionary decision, and the debate is on that. If the default rule is otherwise, you might have a different debate. Some countries also have an automatic link between life expectancy and the retirement age. Not a perfect solution maybe, but it sort of saves the inflammable debate every few years on where exactly should you set the retirement age. So that's one aspect. And maybe last point is, it seems in terms of perception, the pay-as-you-go system is not really well understood in the public debate, and that makes it difficult in particular to have a debate on how to make retirees share in the effort of sort of improving the overall fiscal balance, even though their average standard of living in France is higher than the rest of the population, because there is this fiction that you contributed all your life for your own pension. And of course, the system is not designed that way. You contributed all your life for the pension of people who were then retired. But there is this idea of a moral contract for current retirees that you should not break. And somehow there is not this idea of a moral contract with people currently working, even though the situation is not necessarily different. So again, sort of additional difficulties, but I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. So we move on to Antoine. So it would be great to hear what parallels you see with recent French pension reforms, and you may tell us a little bit more about the differences in life expectancy as well, which you've been researching as well.
Yes, thank you for inviting me, even at the last minute. So I'm not Astrid Panossian, as you may have noticed, and I'm not representing the Minister of Labour or Employment. So I think it's a great ebook. It's, I think, very easy to read. Not talking about my chapter, but all the other chapters. So I'll start by starting from each chapter to say how I connect that with the French situation of current reform, past reforms. So I'll start with chapter 4 from Giulia about the impact of the pension benefit level, and the impact on labor supply. So this has been, in a sense, the first reform in France. In the late 80s, not very clear reform, a change of indexation from wage indexation for both wage reference computation and the benefit computation, which has basically planned a decrease in replacement rate with a major decrease. And this is the biggest reform in France, with no strikes, nobody on the street, nobody noticed. It was, July, a change in indexation rules. Everybody thought actually indexing on inflation is better than inflation on wage growth, because wage, you never know whether the wage will grow. Whereas inflation, of course, it's high inflation. This has reduced basically the change in terms of GDP, the pension spending as share of GDP by 2 percentage points of GDP. It's a huge reform. No strikes. Nobody understood. So yes, pension. But the problem with that is that it takes a long time to actually go through. Actually, it's predicted, as Dorothée was saying, it's predicted to happen that given even with increasing number of retirees to active population, why the French pension spending is planned not to increase and to remain stable or even decrease in some, it's because of that indexation rules, but which took really long time to actually manifest. And people, because it's not very clear, people are not realizing that they will get lower replacement rate, and therefore whether or not there will be big impact on labor supply, it's still unknown, because whether it will be too late to manifest and react. But that will be the first sort of reaction. The second type of, chapter 3, Arthur's chapter about pension incentive versus normal retirement age. In a sense, after the reform, there was this first reform, there was reforms to change the incentives. We had in France since the 80s a system with high penalty for if you retire before getting the full rate, and really no bonuses at all if you retire after. So it was huge incentive just to retire at the full rate age. And then this was changed to actually make it more actually fair, along the lines of what at the time was academic research doing, Gruber and Wise types of research, saying that basically the implicit tax on later retirement did have an impact on retirement, and France moved in that direction with some effects, but not as big an effect as other types of reforms. That's what Arthur is mentioning in chapter 3. So the fact that early retirement age and normal retirement age have a big direct impact for the reason that Arthur mentioned. This is the 2010 reform in France. 2010 reform in France, which increased the early retirement age from 60 to 62, and the age where you get automatically the full rate from 65 to 67. 2 years, and this had a big impact on basically employment of older workers and age at which people withdraw from the labor market. It also had the type of effects that was mentioned in, I don't remember which chapter, but the number of the chapter, the externalities, both on DI and UI, but these effects being smaller than the direct effect as was mentioned by Arthur. Then I'm coming to the chapter 6, which is a question about life expectancy, which I wrote with Maxime Thau and Simon Rabaté, where we looked at how basically we can measure the lifetime life expectancy income gradient, how much difference there is in terms of life expectancy from the poorest to the richest individuals. And the gradient is actually quite steep. With administrative data, we can actually document it very well. It's actually steeper for men than it is for women, where the gradient is much less steeper. But when you then come to policy discussion, is that you cannot implement that sort of gradient within the pension system unless you actually make it separate between men and women. which then will lead to the odd questions that actually, given life expectancy of women is higher, then we should cut pensions for women. Or if not, try to compute the gradient separately for men and women, which even though in itself is problematic. And if you don't do that, and you just measure the life expectancy gradient by both sex, well, the two offset each other. Why? Because you will have typically poorer, higher females being in lower high life expectancy, but this will counteract basically the male differential gradient, and much of the gradient is disappearing when you pool basically both sexes, making as a policy recommendation the way to implement directly the type of life expectancy gradient really not that easy to make as a policy recommendation. And finally, I want to touch on two things that were not directly mentioned or within the ebook, or actually where the relationship with this French situation is not that easy. The first is that when talking about pension policy design in France, there are a number of things that you should think that typically is the reference wage computation. How do you incorporate past wages? How do you index those wages in the past? It plays a huge role. It plays a huge role in terms of the incentive. It plays a huge role in terms of redistribution. How much do you value past wages? And I think this is part of the optimal design of pension, to think about how should we compute past wages, how long the career should be incorporated into the design of pensions. And the fact that it's indexed on inflation in France makes that actually recent wages, recent earnings, have a bigger role in the defining the level of pension than wages or earnings that have been done earlier in career, which leads to a regressive effect, which is neither good nor optimal for incentive effect. So this is part of something which I think should be discussed. Another issue, which I think is how actually there's been specific schemes, and Dorothée mentioned that, in each reforms to make acceptable the fact that we have an increase in early retirement age, to actually create a new early retirement age for specific groups who have started to work earlier, who have specifically long careers. This is the long career track in France, and the latest reform has created even more steps. So now we have a lot of 8 different early retirement age, depending on the tracks you can fall into. Well, this group of individuals, they, in the public debate, why this is perceived, this is something that trade unions are in favor, have been asking and negotiating with the government, is that it's perceived to be actually low-income earners who actually have low life expectancy. And empirically, this is not the case. They actually better off than average and have higher life expectancy than average. And this was not really expected when this was put in place. But in practice, the fact you require a very long career that is full career without any interruption and without any unemployment spell mean that actually only those who have had really good health, really good career have been selected into that long track. And this has not been the target which was initially thought. So this is another example that, depending on the details and how you actually implement something that on paper could look like that you're targeting a specific group, you could miss completely. And the opposite is those who are on incapacity pension or disability pensions actually retire in France later because they don't get access to that early track career, and they have a specific disability early exit, but it's later than the early track career. And those groups have 5 years fewer life expectancy than those who are on the long track early retirement scheme. This is a case where thinking about how to implement the policy advice to a very specific and implementable question is very key. And I will stop here because I'm sure the panel has lots of other things to say. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Antoine. So let's move on to Andrew. So the book emphasizes pension reforms as the response to aging populations, but I think you have a longevity perspective to share on that. And what other areas of public policy should we be prioritizing here?
Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I just want to echo congratulations to the editors and the authors of the report. It's what CEPR does really well. It's good, high-quality academic work on a really important policy topic. And pensions are one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. To guarantee people financial independence into old age was a tremendous achievement and something we've got to make sure we secure, even though life expectancy in society is really different. So this is a really, really big topic. But I'm going to do that discussants thing and talk about things from a completely different angle from the book and talk about the things that I get a little bit obsessed about. And our pension system needs reform for a number of reasons. One is there's a lot more older people, the aging society story, and that's going to cause problems to public finances just from a sort of accounting perspective. And I have to say, a great deal of the focus on raising the state pension age is about solving that fiscal sustainability problem. And that ties us in lots of knots because it doesn't really tackle a deeper underlying problem that I'm going to stress. The other thing we've got is a problem with initial generosity of state pensions, which I think by and large, as lots of steps have been taken. We've heard what France has done. The UK has done something similar. But the real heart of the problem, and we've just been talking about life expectancy, the reason why pensions have to adjust is, I think, increases in life expectancy. And increasingly, life expectancy is driven now not by the chance of getting from 0 to 70, but going from 70 to 90. In the UK, and we're not particularly good at life expectancy, the Government Statistical Office says 50% of children born today will live to be into their early 90s. And that's what's putting a really big, long stress on our system. If you look at 1970 life expectancy in France, these are all period measures, and today it's been an increase of 6 years over the last 50 in life expectancy at 64. So we just haven't adapted to that length of life that we can now expect. And for me, talking about parametric changes in the state pension system, raising the contribution rate, lowering the benefit, changing the state pension age, that may be an effort at achieving fiscal sustainability, but doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is if we're living for longer, we need to produce more resources over our lifetime. And that's the key issue that we have to embed this whole debate around. And for me, that's what we really got to tackle from a macroeconomic point of view. And creating more resources over our lifetime, raising the state pension age does very little to achieve that. I'm a big fan of the Irish author Sam Beckett, who lived in Paris. I call it an example of Sam Beckett economics. Beckett wrote some dismal words, but he says, I can't go on, I must go on, I will go on, which is kind of the sort of what happens to people in the labour market. You just say, hey, you've got to work for longer. How do they work for longer? We focused on the whole distributional issue, but basically our institutions don't invest in our human capital for long enough to make the most of the longer lives that we've got. We need to make sure that life isn't just longer, but it's also healthier, productive, and engaged for longer. And I can see little connection between that and just raising the state pension age. This clearly has to be part of a much broader policy response. I talk about how do we create a longevity society, not an aging society. I think economics has been very much enthralled to the demographers in seeing all that's happening is just a rise in the proportion of older people. We're also changing how we age. I think that's the really, really interesting point from a life cycle perspective. I always say at 59, I'm different from my father and my grandfather at 59 because I got more years ahead of me. So how do we adjust to that? And that's really important because the root cause of our challenge is, of course, pensions is indexed upon chronological age. And I'll come on to that a little bit more. But the problem here is that aging is malleable. This side of 85, the estimates are around about 80% of how you age is down to your behaviour and your environment. Hence these huge inequalities that cause so many problems when we start looking at chronological age. To make a benefit or a tax contingent on a state variable that isn't really very informative about people's behaviour is what creates all these public economic problems that we've been talking about. It's really hard to tackle distributional issues when there's so much heterogeneity. I've got a CEPR discussion paper that just come out recently with David Bloom and Raina Kochsky, and we look at the HRS And we basically find that once you condition upon physiological functioning, measures of frailty, chronological age has no role to play in determining people's economic decisions. And this is the really big challenge. For most of human history, we haven't known how old we were. But in the late 1800s, we started to see improvements in numeracy and literacy, improvements in record keeping, and we started to focus on chronological age. And this is some of the challenges that we're sort of facing. And I'm going to go away from the historical and philosophy a little bit later. But I'm much taken recently by reading about in the UK in the 16th century, forgive me, this is a long-running issue, where we introduced the Elizabethan Poor Laws. And the Poor Laws were introduced to look after the poor and the old. But this was a society that had no chronological measures of age. So old was defined as people who had been around for a long time and could no longer look after themselves. And that was how this was interpreted. If you've been around a long time and you look after yourself, you weren't considered to be old. Now you can imagine the problems of that in terms of running a sort of a pension scheme or a support scheme. You had to have a test to prove your competence. And people got very cross with the arbitrary nature of that, the intrusion that occurred. And so there's kind of widespread support for the introduction of chronological age as a basis for how we think about regulation and legislation. The trouble is when more and more people are living beyond 65, the older you get, kind of the less reliable chronological age is to tell you about someone's condition. And I think that's our really, really, really big issue here, other than talking about fiscal sustainability. It's why we get all these distributional issues around inequality, because simply you can be an economics professor at 90 and doing absolutely fine. You can be a construction worker age 50 and you've got really, really big problems. And the more we start talking about an aging society, the more we just put everyone together in a bracket of people aged over 65, the more we're ignoring the really real issues of how do we pull the levers to make sure people age better. Of course, it's important to design a pension system to have good distributional implications, but why don't we try and tackle to make sure people don't have lower life expectancy by 14 years if they're in the lower income brackets? What can we do to make sure that they're more likely to be healthy and have the skills to work? So those are some of the issues that I would like to try and focus on, move away from this rather monolithic attitude. Let me try and be a little bit more constructive in terms of things that I think are important. The first is, I think, one of the challenges of focusing on the state pension age is we miss a really important age group, which is 50 to 65. Now, actually, France is quite good at 50 to 65 in terms of labour force participation rate. But in my country, at 50, about 80% of people are working. At 65, which is 2 years before the state pension age, it's down to about a third. Wow, what could we do to try and stop that decline between 50 and 65? Just back of the envelope calculations that tell you if you could half that rate of decline, that's another 4% of GDP. So we want to do something about fiscal sustainability. What about trying to focus on 50 to 65? Because if you're not working at 65, you're certainly not going to be working at 67. It's very hard to get re-entry. So why are people not working? Well, it's often to do with health, either their own or they've got to care for someone. There's certainly ageism in the workplace, skills may be out of date, there's a whole host of reasons, but really how do we keep people productive for longer? I think focusing on the state pension age is not necessarily the place to begin, either for distributional issues or for macroeconomic issues. How do we think of health? How do we think of skills? And how do we think about age-friendly jobs? A construction worker works in one of the least age-friendly occupations there is. I'm an economics professor. I work in one of the most age-friendly jobs there is. How do we make sure we have directed labour market support to help people move from one job to another? That seems to me to be really key. I mentioned about life expectancy. One of the really big problems we've got is we're keeping people alive, but we're not keeping them healthy for longer. It's the switch from infectious to chronic diseases is a major problem. And that's another reason why I'm a bit concerned about linking the state pension age to life expectancy. If you play around with a sort of life cycle theory model, what you're going to say is you want the retirement age to be where the marginal benefit of work is equal to the marginal cost of working, and that's going to be really influenced by your health. So basically, the state pension age should be some function of a population measure of healthy life expectancy. It doesn't have to be the average because we have to worry about inequality issues. But that seems to me a much better social contract to say to people, hey, I'm keeping you healthier for longer, I need you to work for longer. But to have a world where people are living longer but not healthier for longer and they've got to work for longer, that doesn't sound a particularly great social contract. I think we've also got to get ministries of finance to recognise that if they can invest in health, you see benefits to come, because right now we're just also trying to cut down health expenditure, which is focused very much upon treating diseases rather than prevention and keeping people healthy. We need to make sure that in the heart of a system with an ageing society, we have a measure of healthy life expectancy which is driving resources, linking treasury and the health sector together. Because I have this vision of that chronological age is such a weak state variable, I mean, if you think about it as an economist, it's not really a very informative variable, chronological age. Perhaps how many years you've got to go might be important. Perhaps your biological age, your health is important. But chronological age itself really isn't. So if you want to try and solve some of these public economic problems, you've got to reduce the role of chronological age and increase the role of other variables in this decision making. Which of course goes back to the question of why do we have a pension? What are we trying to achieve with a pension? Are we just rewarding people for making it to 64, 65 or 66? Is it because people can't plan for the long term, or are we trying to solve inequality? These are all issues we have to rethink when the vast majority of the population will live long enough to receive a pension. And then I'll just sort of do one other thing to sort of close, because I could talk for ages about this topic because it's so interesting. I think in economics we've got to change the narrative. You know, I don't know how many of you, when you hear the phrase ageing society, sort of fist pump the air with delight and joy. Throughout my career as an economist, I've always seen as an ageing society as a problem, but that's a bit weird, isn't it? It's one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. It's fewer children lost in infancy, fewer parents snatched away in midlife, more grandparents meeting their grandchildren. And all we do in economic conferences is say, shit, we've got an ageing society. It's truly phenomenal. And let me tell you another little fact I rather like. Over the last 100 years in the United Kingdom and the United States, the old age dependency ratio has tripled. I don't know of a single economic piece of work that says that's been a problem for UK or US economic growth. Over the next 50 years, it's going to rise by 50%. It's tripled the last 100 years. It's going to rise by 50% the next 50 years. Aging is malleable. Demography is not destiny. We kind of take for granted these things are bad, but there may be huge opportunities here if we can invest in human capital. So I think we need to be not just recognize the problems of an aging society, but perhaps also recognize some of the opportunities that come from having a longer life, which is why I put my advert in for the research policy network that has been mentioned earlier, which is called the Economics of Longevity and Aging, not Aging and Longevity. Because I do think it's about time in macro we started to say, hey, how do we invest in human capital and how we turn this to a good thing, not a bad thing? That seems to be a much broader set of policies than just raising the state pension age with an eye on fiscal sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. So, Camille, you have the honor to give a concluding perspective before we turn to the floor for some questions.
Working? Great. Yeah, I prepared some slides. I'll try to be super brief. I'd like to keep some time for the Q&A. What I'll do, thank you, is try to take this opportunity to summarize a lot of the themes that cut across the different interventions. Should also add as a disclaimer that when we started working on pension with Johannes, to be totally frank, I saw it was super complicated, quite boring as well. I'm going to try to show you how we've tried to clarify things for us. It might be oversimplistic, but I think it helps a lot. I can't promise that I'm going to make it fun, though, but I think it's our attempt at this. And to start with, let's put this in the French context. She's going to speak to what Andrew was saying, but look, France is not faring that well. The longevity context in France is that we are starting from historically low labor supply level of the elderly. And I think it has been mentioned by a lot of people on this panel that has implication not just for the pension system. I think it has really implication for fiscal sustainability, broadly speaking. Why? Because, you know, at the end of the day, working more when you're in old age has really important implication for the entire budget because you create a lot of fiscal revenues through the income tax and so on and so forth. So you see what's really fascinating about France is that the main difference compared to all these countries, so you have the UK, the US, Germany. So France is doing very poorly at the very beginning of the life cycle and at the very end. In particular, starting it at age 55, basically, there is a massive drop. And you can see that this divergence is historically a really important divergence between France and the rest of developed nations. We started diverging basically in the late 70s, and then even though there has been an uptake in employment rate of the 50, 74 years old, it's still much lower. So the question I'm going to ask is not as broad as what Andrew was mentioning, which is how do we make it, an opportunity? I'm just going to focus on the much narrower question of how can pension policies how can they be useful in addressing the labor supply challenge in old age? And I agree, it's not the end of the story, but at least it's a nice way to think about public policies helping there. And the way I'm going to think about this is, again, trying to simplify our thinking. And the simplest way you can think of creating incentives for people to work longer is essentially either making a penalty by reducing pension benefits for people who retire early, or to the contrary, giving more benefits for people who retire later. And so a lot of these different ways of tweaking the pension profile are discussed in the ebook. The one thing to keep in mind is that, you know, you push that pension profile one way or the other, you're going to have effects on labor supply. Okay, that's great. But at the end of the day, you also care about the distribution impacts that have. So take this kind of stylized reform, for instance, which is, you know, the typical reform that we've seen in many developed nations. You can see that one, for instance, is going to essentially push everybody to work longer, but at the same time, it's going to hurt the people who tend to retire early, and it's going to actually benefit the people who tend to retire late. And so the fundamental question is not so much, okay, yeah, I can see this incidence. The question is it socially valuable? Can I put a number on the insurance or redistributive costs of this type of redistribution? Okay, and that's a little bit what we've been trying to focus on with Johannes over the past 2-3 years. And so just to summarize our key findings, and we're doing that here in the context of Sweden, but I think these can be replicated in many other contexts. So if you think of people who retire at different ages, and here we've grouped them into like 4 groups. So you have the very early retirees who retire before 60. What's really fascinating about them is that in every context, they have extremely low consumption in retirement. They have very bad health, and they have very low life expectancy. Okay, but to the contrary, if you look at the people who retire late, so after 65, they always have very high level of consumption in retirement and very high life expectancy, and in general, very good health. Okay, and the interesting age range is really 60 to 65, where you don't necessarily see a lot of differences in terms of their consumption level or their health or their life expectancy, but actually you see quite a lot of wealth effects there. So if you have more wealth, you have the ability to essentially retire early, well, you're going to take that leisure, and so wealth effects are very large. That's also a topic that Giulia has covered quite a lot in her work. So what that means is, well, if you want to do reforms but only focus on retirement age, one of the dangers is that you cannot push too much incentives both for very early retirees and for very late retirees. Why? Well, because these reforms are very regressive. They tend to have very bad distributional consequences, and that limits quite hardly how much you can push the profile in order to raise employment in old age. So fundamentally, the question is, but can we do better? Can we actually find reforms that are clever and that enable, at the same time, an increase in labor supply and some good distributional properties? And one thing I want to show you is that, yeah, it's possible. You just have to be clever. I mean, not clever to the point of not being understandable. I fully agree with Dorothée on this. You want reforms that are relatively simple, but there is a very good tag, and the good tag is career length. Career length, actually, so if you take that graph on the right-hand side, you have the level of consumption, for instance, of people who retire, condition on the age at which they retire, with different lengths, career lengths that they had at age 55. And what you see is actually like a negative gradient here. What does that mean? It means that if you take individuals who retire at any age, the ones that retire with the longer career lengths have actually the lower consumption level. In general, they also have lower health quality and so on and so forth. So what that means is that if you were to actually push incentives by rewarding career length at the moment you retire, you have all the right properties. You essentially create an incentive to work longer, and you actually redistribute towards individuals who have lower consumption, lower health, and so on and so forth. So in the context of France, and we can have endless debates here, but I think what that speaks to is that, you know, the early retirement age, the âge d'ouverture des droits, that has been used quite a lot as a tool. And I understand it's easy, it's simple, it creates immediately a lot of fiscal revenues. I don't think that's necessarily the best tool compared to something that would target career length, such as the durée d'assurance in the French context as a policy lever. So I'll stop there, but I think that's essentially where we are trying to push this agenda, which is clarifying, simplifying the way we're thinking about pension reform, really kind of putting numbers, quantifying both the fiscal effects and the redistributive effects, and trying to find clever ways, but not too complicated ways, to increase both labor supply in old age and distributional characteristics of our pension systems. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot to our panel members here. So Andrew mentioned the divergence between chronological age and biological age. There has been a little bit of a divergence between allocated time. I allocated them all 7 minutes, and they generously used about 15 minutes each. So we only have a couple of minutes left for the Q&A, but I would love to hear from the audience if there are some questions here for our panel. So I think we have a microphone. Can we, or I think you can just raise your voice. Some questions, yes.
I have a question that's a bit broader to go back to the presentation by Giulia and Arthur. To what extent you can really differentiate normal retirement age or early retirement age from financial incentives? Because in some sense, like my understanding is that these ages are normal retirement age because they go together with certain financial incentives or with a certain package. And so it seems that in the discussion seems to be like a kind of a difference between thought about like what is the retirement ages in terms of like focal points, but my internet was focal points because they go together with financial incentives. And so to what extent is the point that small financial incentives just to indicate this is retirement age have much broader effect than just the financial incentives, or how could we think about these two different aspects like separately? So I don't know if it's a question for the panel.
Arthur, the honor is yours now.
Yeah, thanks. So is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the way the empirical literature has disentangled these effects is usually by looking at policies that purely change financial incentives without any kind of normal or other statutory retirement age being involved, versus reforms that change these statutory retirement ages. But these reforms, as you say, typically also involve some changes in incentives in people's budget constraints that are in some ways institutionally linked to these ages. Yeah, but so that's basically the variation. So pure financial incentives versus policies that change these reference ages together with incentives. And then what the literature has found in actually a lot of different countries is that the policy that changes the statutory age has a much bigger effect than that purely changes financial incentives. So in a way, the difference is kind of attributed to the statutory age. But yeah, these things have not really been decoupled institutionally, so it would be kind of hard to see what would be the effect of like a pure change in the statutory age without changing any financial incentive.
I think many countries are moving away from statutory ages as well, and I think one thing we don't know yet is how responsive people are to financial incentives in the absence of these statutory ages. It's something to be found out. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes.
This is a question for Andrew Scott. If I understood your intervention correctly, you were basically advocating that we should be thinking about retirement much more broadly in the context of the working life cycle. And that would suggest that we should be thinking of pensions in conjunction with things like social welfare programs and disability insurance that even during working life are also meant to buffer people against the risk of basically dropping out of the labor force. And I was wondering whether you subscribe to that broader view of policy design.
Yeah, no, I do. I think, I go back to age is just a really increasingly weak indicator of someone's economic and financial needs, and how we deal with that as a problem when more and more of the population are at that age. I also think that, if you take a simple life cycle model, if you make people live for longer, they're going to change their behaviors. And I think that leads to a very different working pattern and working career. A simple life cycle model would tell you that if you've got to work for longer, you're going to need to have more education. So you might start work later. You're going to probably want to do some variations in your career. I mean, in a business school world, I always sort of say we invented a 3-stage life in the 20th century of education, work, and retirement. And as we're living longer and longer, I'm not sure stretching that out makes sense. So, basically, the simple version I would say is that in an optimal model, in the 20th century, we just added more and more leisure after the retirement age because we didn't change the state pension age, but we saw people living for longer. I think as we raise the state pension age by whatever amount in whatever way, we'll see more people choose to take leisure this side of retirement, part-time working, breaks, whatever. And I think that involves quite a fundamental shift in how we think about social security systems. Which goes back to the question, what is the point of the pension? Not what we should scrap it, but what is the problem it is trying to solve? And if it's about income inequality, then age is a pretty poor indicator.
Yes, Gary.
Well, you did not talk about the point system, the retirement by point accumulation. Maybe I'm not using the right vocabulary.
Notional account.
Yeah, notional accounts, exactly. So is this completely outdated? Or? I remember that Antoine Bozio has written a monograph on this. It was supposed to influence Macron, our president. You didn't say a word about the
So, yes. So, in 2019, there was a big debate in France to be clear, so I advocated in France the big reforms to move from a current system with we have 42 different mandatory schemes with different rules that are extremely complex, and advocated to move to something much simpler based on NDC, national accounts, so that we have automatic linkage with life expectancy, something which actually was progressive because a better computation of lifetime earnings would valuing earlier earnings earlier in life. But I think Dorothée alluded to that. I mean, the reform debate was actually very difficult, not less difficult than actually the most recent debate about increasing early retirement age. But it's true that it was very difficult to actually come across in the public debate what was the true effect of the reform. People had a hard time understanding why actually from moving from the best 25 years index on inflation to lifetime earnings indexed on wage growth that was actually beneficial for those with actually not less steep career than those with steeper career. I went on TV trying to explain that, and people were like, no, of course, if we take the lifetime earnings, then it's worse. Even though it's not, but it's difficult to actually explain that across the public. And then there were lots of different issues when you're trying to move to 40 different schemes to actually one simpler scheme. Actually, a lot of people are checking, am I a loser, am I a gainer, what Dorothée was mentioning. And it's very difficult to actually to come across. It was, moving from a very complex system to a simpler system is actually a very complex effect. Yeah. You need to understand very well the current system to be able to explain who is going to be impacted by that simplification. But if you ask me again, if I'm still in favor of NDC system, I'll still think I'll be in favor of NDC system, adding other sort of focal point to try to make the the retirement age focal point more salient than it is in NDC system. But whether I would be able to convince NDC policymakers in the near future to actually do that, very low chance.
But can I add, I don't think any of the issues we've discussed would disappear with the NDC system. Look, Sweden has an NDC system, but they still have the same issues of how do you deal with, minimum pensions, how do you deal with heterogeneous life expectancy. So it makes the overall piloting of the system much simpler, and in terms of fiscal sustainability, of course, that's great, but that doesn't solve any of the issues related to who should work longer, who should pay for what type of reforms, and so on and so forth.
So, very last question. Came up very briefly.
No, and I think this is an issue. It is very, because the only lever you have really to make current retirees contribute is the level of pensions. I think the terminology in the book was cutting the level of pensions. We never do that, but we tried even in the last now defunct budget to index pensions less than inflation, then to do it only for pensions above a certain threshold. This politically is a dead end. And so this is all. Now, this being said, so that means the reforms, yes, pretty much put disproportionately the burden on currently active people, which also has bad priorities. This being said, what Antoine mentioned is very important. It is that, this old reform of indexing to inflation rather than wages, it keeps having an impact year after year after year. If we look at our long-term projections on the pension system, basically today the ratio of the average pension to the average labor income is a bit higher than 100%. By 2070, it is projected to fall to 75%. So sort of over the long term, actually, the sort of balance of the pension system, if rules stay unchanged, and this is a big assumption, is actually sort of rebalancing the effort towards retirees. Now, the problem I see with that is that I think the political economy issue will not disappear. And therefore, I think these projections that show, France, long term, the share of pensions in GDP does not increase, actually decreases. Because of this effect, is probably not going to be politically sustainable for the next 50 years. And so this kind of gives a false sense of security. You look at the long-term projection, well, there's not much of a problem. Well, actually there is, because, if I had to bet, I would bet that at some point there will be a policy change. Will it be a series of one-offs? Will it be a change, a mix between indexation to wages, inflation? I don't know. But I don't think this is sustainable for 50 years. So, yeah.
Can I add just one thing?
Last word.
No, but really important. We talked a lot about redistribution within cohorts. It's just we needed to start somewhere, and the ebook was really much about this. that the framework developed can really much be applied to intergenerational redistribution. The difficulty is, of course, to do the exercise of doing the measurement and the quantification. That has never been done, really well. But wait for the next ebook, the CEPR.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much again to the editors and the panelists.